Welcome to Podsauce. I'm Dax Holt.
I am Alesha Renee, and this is your podcast discovery show.
Any podcast you're looking for, any recommendations, that is why we're here. We're sifting through the 3 million podcasts, 50 million episodes that are floating around out there to bring you the greatest and the best.
So much stuff out there, so much good stuff out there. Right now, obviously, we're still in the Ponderosa. And people just need a little assistance in getting through the ebbs and flows of just life these days. So in saying that, health is wealth is one of our categories that I really love, and I have a podcast that I really feel you guys will enjoy as well, and it is called Anxiety Slayer. I like this podcast. I actually listened to the episode about guided meditation when dealing with worrying thoughts.
Okay.
Disclaimer though, if you listen to that episode, don't do so while operating a vehicle.
Just swerving down the freeway?
I don't know what was wrong with me. I was on my way to a meeting. It's a very important meeting. I was super stressed. My mind tends to create 8 scenarios ahead of time. And so I was like, I have work to do. Let me just, because this is a podcast discovery show. We're discovering these podcasts as well for the most part. And I put on the guided meditation one because I'm like, oh, speaks to my spirit. Before long, by the 4th, and you're relaxed. I'm like, huh? Oh.
Do they give any warnings on the podcast? No! Hey, heads up, you will go into a deep trance here?
Well, here's the thing. The podcast is just all encompassing, right? There are some episodes that align itself more so with therapy, and then there are some that are led by professionals in their chosen field, and so they're giving great advice. And then there are some, like one of the ones that I listen to, that are guided practices. So I totally just, I don't know what I was thinking, but it works. I say all that to say, because I was no longer worried about what I was worrying about. Now it's like, stay awake, Leash. Get it together. So yes, Anxiety Slayer is my Health is Wealth podcast pick. I feel like you guys will love. We're going to put a link up to the episode that I'm speaking about, and it's a guided meditation when you have worrying thoughts.
Well, I think that is great because I feel like there is times in my life that I need something like that, so I will check that one out. And a part of our show is not only are we helping you guys discover, but we're also bringing on podcasters to help them tell their story and maybe introduce you to their podcast. And today we've got Jed Lipinski, who has a massive podcast.
Yeah.
It's called Gone South. It is in the top 10 on the charts right now. It's blowing up, and so we're going to have him on to talk about his podcast and this murder mystery that it surrounds.
It's a mystery to you guys. I, however, have solved the crime. I know who did it. and knows who did it, and I am so curious to once I broach this with Jed, to see if he concurs, my good friend. And I feel very strongly that he will. You guys don't forget to go to our website, podsauce.com, and on there you will get more information on today's episode, all of our previous episodes. Dax has some picks.
Well, I got a great pick for you this week. And if I look back in the chart of who's got more points for bringing better picks, I'm pretty
land
sure
of Dax?
I am dominating.
In the land
of
Dax?
Plan to continue dominating today with this one.
So is this a podcast pick that you wrote from one of our previous guests? Because you like to do that.
Listen.
Did Angie, our showrunner, assist you?
The whole premise of the show is get recommendations and then recommend them, right?
So that is a yes. I will take your silence as a yes.
But I always give people credit. And yes, it may have been one of our previous guests. But nevertheless, we got so much more coming up on Podsauce. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to Podsauce, guys, your podcast discovery show. It is that time where Dax completely humiliates himself with his pick.
You mean humiliates you, because my pick is so great that everyone loves my picks, and that's why I'm winning the competition of better picks.
Feign interest, however.
Whatever.
Nevertheless, take it away, Dax.
So, my pick for this week, which is a phenomenal pick, is called How I Built This.
God, that sounds so familiar.
It is an NPR podcast. It may have been recommended by a former guest on our podcast called Ken from You Better You Bet.
But
nevertheless, He mentioned it. I happened to listen to it,
Okay.
and it is a phenomenal podcast. So it's this guy, the host, his name is Guy, and he interviews people in, that have become very successful in their industry. So the episode that I personally listened to was the CEO of Kodiak Cakes. Have you ever had Kodiak Cakes? Like pancakes, they're like protein pancakes.
No.
They're huge. They're like in Target, whatever. They're a massive $200 million a year brand. I'm a big fan of the pancakes, so that's what got me interested. But the owner's name is Joel Clark, and it talks about his start into the industry. He was 8 years old when it's his mother's recipe for the pancakes, and he was going door to door with his red wagon, literally selling pancake mix. And he believed in this product, and he stepped away from it for a long time, came back, and it was basically he was trying to sell these pancakes for like 15 years. And it really wasn't going anywhere. He was putting his life into it, all of his money, and then he would like get a step ahead and basically, oh, I got into a couple retailers, but then there was a costly mistake that cost him $50,000 because there was a coupon issue. His dad bailed him out. Then he gets a PO with Target eventually, and they needed $280,000 worth of product. He went to his dad for a loan. Like, it was just such a wonderful story about this rise and all the issues that he had getting to where he was. I mean, the guy broke down talking about his dad loaning him money on this podcast. And he also did Shark Tank. He didn't get a deal on Shark Tank, but this company is so successful now that it was a really cool in-depth look, and the host asks amazing questions. And I started an episode this morning, I haven't finished it yet, and it's the guy who created Discovery Channel and what he went through and how he got into cable TV when cable TV was like just starting up. He's like, yeah, they were talking about starting a CNN and an MTV. It was just, so I'm really excited. I'm excited to get back into the car to finish this episode. I really, really like it. And if you're into finding out how companies started, I suggest you listen to How I Built This.
We're going to put Dax's podcast pick up on our webpage, podsauce.com, and
We're
you
going
guys
to put
can
a point up for Dax at the same time.
You just have to stay petty, huh?
Yep.
Never change, Dax.
Gotta stay petty.
Stay petty.
But in the winners.
And you guys make sure to go to our YouTube page. That is at the Podsauce. Like,
sure you
subscribe, follow us, see us in person because we are quite razzling and dazzling. Don't go anywhere, guys. We have more. This is Podsauce.
Welcome back to Podsauce. Leash, I'm excited.
It's a good one.
This is a huge podcast. We have Jed Lipinski on, host of the C13 original, Gone South.
Yeah.
This podcast is massive. It has been in the top 10 of the U.S. pod charts.
Yeah.
It's blowing up. Everyone's really into this. How would you describe this podcast?
I mean, it revolves around the unsolved murder over 3 decades later of Margaret Coon, who was a huge advocate, ally, lawyer in her community, and it's just littered with whodunits. I have my pick about whodunit, but before we get into that, let's just welcome Jed to the show. Let's just get this thing going.
What up, Jed?
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I think the thing that was so alarming for me and really connecting is Margaret's originally from Alexandria, Louisiana. I was raised in Alexandria, Louisiana. There were so many touch points that were very familiar to me being a Louisiana native. I'm born in Lake Charles, Louisiana, as they know here. What do you think is the draw that makes this story over 30-something years later still so, what's the word, intriguing? For me, it's because it seems like the town that she was from, anybody could have done it. I mean, there's a whole list of people that we can go through. I'll give you my theory a little later, but what do you think is the big draw of why this story is still so attractive all these years later?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are lots of different reasons. One, she was just she was the embodiment of the aspirations of this place called St. Tammany Parish, which is where she died. She was, like the poster child of St. Tammany at the time. She was beautiful, but that was just, one of many aspects of her existence there. She was a really successful attorney. She was extremely invested in the community. She was married to the former mayor of the town. She was also just extremely generous person. Everyone loved her. And she was extremely committed assistant district attorney at the time, who was taking on some of the toughest cases in this community. On top of that, she was living in one of the first gated communities in Louisiana at the time, in St. Tammany, called Beauchene. They had security gate, they had security guards, it was patrolled. It was basically inconceivable that someone of her stature professionally, in the most kind of exclusive, gated, safest neighborhood in this, what was then considered basically the safest and most exclusive parish, which is like a county in Louisiana, as you know.
Right.
It was inconceivable that someone like that could be murdered, and I think that's one of the biggest things. I'll just end by saying that consistently, when I was doing the interviews for this project, I would call people, and it's 34 years later, and they would tell me, "It is so funny you called. I was just thinking about Margaret, like just thinking about her, like last weekend, 34 years later. Like, why?" And that was consistent. I heard that from like over half a dozen people. It was just, the story just, as you know, really sticks with people.
So, Jed, the way that as a listener to Gone South, it seemed like a real life version of the game of Clue, where you're jumping from person to person. What I'm curious is, you being the host and you doing these interviews, did you also have that kind of same, oh, it's this person, oh, no, now it's this person, or is that just the way you laid it out for the listener?
Yeah, it's a really funny question. I could be sort of deceptive by saying that I just did that for the effect, but in truth, it was like I was, and I feel almost naive saying this in some ways because I'm a pretty experienced investigative reporter who's worked on a lot of projects like this, but I was like totally convinced that different characters that we go through were guilty.
Just to piggyback off of Dax's question, and to kind of get a little deeper into your response, Jed, because you prefaced the episode, the series, with asking the listeners to just keep an open mind and don't jump to the conclusion so that we don't go down this rabbit hole. I have a question about the guy who claims that he saw someone run away with a knife. And I'm speaking about, hear me now.
I'm excited because Leash came in, she was like, I think I know who did it.
I think I know who did it.
She's been talking about your podcast this morning.
Unless, Jed, you have some information that you didn't share on the podcast, did we find an alibi and shake down the guy who claims he saw someone run away with the knife? Because I'm thinking that could be a red herring. You know what I mean? What about him? Does he have an alibi? Did anyone investigate him? Or did they just say, oh, he's a witness and he's crazy, so we're just going to keep it pushing? Where was he?
So, beautiful. I love the analysis and the theory.
I went to school for law, Jed.
Did you?
I did.
Yes, I did know that. I saw that on your bio. I should have been prepared for this level of questioning.
It's the headline of her bio.
This gentleman, I think the guy that you're referring to is named David Talley. He was a valet who saw somebody run away with a knife.
Quote unquote.
He was that night, an hour before Margaret was stabbed in the back with a knife. He allegedly saw someone run away from the crime scene with a knife. Okay. Pretty significant detail. He was questioned once and then came back and apparently provided more testimony to the detectives. They, for whatever reason, we've heard various responses, didn't quite trust him. He was a little bit weird, they would say, or he was kind of strange guy. And I'm like, well, doesn't that make him even more suspicious to you? Either way, this gentleman unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. We spoke with his brother. He had various theories about David Talley's truthfulness, potential involvement. None of them really panned out.
Jed, you and me, babe. I think we did it. Unless there's something that I don't know yet, send me a text, but I think we did it.
Yeah.
Jed, question for you.
Solid theory.
Because we are a podcast discovery show, is there podcasts that you as a creator podcast are listening to that are enjoying that could recommend to our audience?
Definitely. This is for Cadence 13, and I'm a huge fan of their podcasts. That's why I decided to pitch this story to them. The ones I would recommend and that I've really enjoyed from C13 are To Live and Die in LA, which is by Neil Strauss, the excellent Rolling Stone journalist, author, celebrity. He's done 2 seasons now. They're both just really compelling. Neil is a wonderful narrator, and it's just kind of gripping. And he's very sensitive too. I think that's a really important aspect of like a podcast host when it comes to true crime. You have to find some people that are really sensitive. Relative Unknown and Root of Evil are also podcasts that I listen to by C13, true crime variety. My colleague on this podcast, Lloyd Lockridge, who is the director of the show, worked on both of those, and you can see his signature on them both. They're really good. Outside C13, I listen to and enjoy the Campside media podcasts. Those include recently like Suspect, Hooked is one of theirs.
What's that? What's Hooked about?
Hooked, it's Hooked is about an opioid addict that became one of the most prolific bank robbers in history.
Oh,
Dope.
sign me up. All right, Jed. Hooked it is.
Hooked. Jed,
Totally.
I want to ask you one last question, and it is multi-layered. Why this story? Why Margaret Coon? Is there any personal connection to you?
Yeah, why this story? I mean, it kind of came to me organically, and that's what I like. It was told to me by a former DEA agent that I'd become friends with when I was working on my last documentary project called The Pharmacist for Netflix, and so word of mouth stories are the way that I like to get stories as opposed to find them online. But more to your point, like Margaret was just a beautiful human being. And she was murdered, and it's terrible, of course, but it wasn't really a gruesome murder. I get a little squeamish. I'm not into like the forensic details of murder exactly. That's not really what gets me excited. What gets me excited is the ability to explore places and people. And Margaret was just like a really fascinating human being at a really fascinating time and place. And I think that, fortunately or not, her murder, if there's a silver lining, is that it allowed me to explore and expose who this person was. And a lot of people have written me since this came out to say that they were really inspired by what she managed to achieve in her, unfortunately short lifetime. So I think that's for me moving forward is in the podcast world. Hopefully we'll be able to make more true crime projects together with C13. But finding fascinating individuals, that's really what I'm after.
I mean, and you found one.
It's
This is a really good podcast.
It really is.
And for anyone that hasn't checked out the C13 original, Gone South, we will put up a link on podsauce.com, direct you guys right there, and you can check out Jed's entire series. It's really good.
You do have to listen to it in sequential order, and it's so good, Jed. One last thing that I loved about it is that you also tied in like Dead Man Walking, because there's so many different characters that have inspired other works of art that are out there that you guys have seen. I mean, it's Academy Award-winning project. So Jed Lipinski, host of Gone South. Thank you so much, Jed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
We got a lot more coming up. This is Podsauce.
Welcome back to Podsauce, everyone, your podcast discovery show. D, what you got for me?
Well, I just want to let everyone know that we spent the entire commercial break talking about how great my pick was.
Oh my gosh.
So I definitely got a point on that, but we're not going to dwell too much on that. We are going to move on to the next topic.
I'm going to give you half a point because you got an assist, but I will give you half of a point. I will say that. It was a really good pick.
Well, we have another feature on here called If You Like This, You'll Like That. If you like this, you'll like that. Which is basically as exactly what you hear. If you are into a podcast, I'm going to recommend another podcast that you might also be interested in. So if you've ever heard of the podcast To Live and Die in LA, it's funny because Jed earlier in this episode mentioned this.
It, yeah.
A lot of people are into this podcast.
We've talked about it on our show, which, you know, is just beating a little too close to home.
Murder, Hollywood. Well, I have another recommendation for you, and it's called The Wonderland Murders.
Break it down.
So The Wonderland Murders, very famous murder that happened in Hollywood on Laurel Canyon.
Oof.
You know, it's one night, 4 people murdered in the same house.
Are you serious?
It was a drug-fueled rampage by a gang where they went through and were killing people left and right. This was extremely famous murder, and this podcast dives into it. The host of it actually, like, grew up focused on this. He is talking to investigators, police, anyone that was involved in it during that time. So you're getting firsthand accounts with people that lived through this murder that really changed the shape of America because people were so creeped out by it. Because you've got, if you remember, the Hollywood Hills seemed like the peaceful, fun time where musicians were hanging out, and it was kind of like the focal point back in the 70s and 80s. And
I got a couple homies that live along Laurel Canyon. Block is hot.
So he dives into it. I got about an episode and a half in, and he tells the story really well. So if you're into this type of true crime, you're into LA, you're like Manson murders and all that kind of stuff, you will like this. So if you're into To Live and Die in LA, I'm going to assume you will also like The Wonderland Murders.
We'll have to put a link up to that podcast on our webpage, which is podsauce.com.
Big shout out, by the way, to Jed Lipinski for stopping by from Gone South. Thank you. Congratulations on all your success. And if you're looking for
our success, because we solved the crime. Jed, you and I have solved the crime, Jed.
You are
champagne on us.
Ridiculous. But if you guys want to follow us, obviously at the Podsauce, and then I am at Dax Holt.
I am Alesha Renee. And until next time, thank you all so much for watching, for listening, for joining. We just really appreciate it. Until next time, be good to yourselves.